Janey Lee Grace. Welcome to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show on UK Health Radio. Hi, and welcome to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show. I'm Janey Lee Grace on UK Health Radio, which is, of course, the world's #1 talk health radio station specialising in health and well-being. And as you know, on this show, I cover just all aspects of holistic health. And goodness, over the years, we've had such an incredible range of topics, and nothing is really off limits for me, because as long as it really does look at, bring in the holistic picture, because I think that's where it's so important. So often people have said to me, I love the book that you wrote, Imperfectly Natural Woman, and I really love the section on skincare. So why don't you focus just on holistic, optimum, skincare and beauty, and just talk about that, and maybe you could have a range of skincare products. And the amount of times people have said that kind of thing to me, I really think that you should niche down, and you should just talk about skincare, or I think you should just talk about, electromagnetic frequencies in the home, because I've heard you speak about that, and on and on. How can you possibly focus on one thing? I really don't believe you can. I think everything impacts on everything else. So that's why my show covers just a huge range of stuff, really, and a huge range of topics around health and well-being. And obviously, in the last few years, my absolute passion has been to recognise the importance of sobriety that underpins everything. Now, I am absolutely not preaching at anybody. No way. It's completely non-judgmental. But my approach, it comes from my own experience, which, as many of you know, is that, I was focusing on holistic health and well-being, eating really well, ditching the chemicals, focusing on mindset and spirituality and meditation and just about everything. And yet I was stepping around this huge elephant in the room that was alcohol. I was never at rock bottom. I was never clinically dependent. I never needed to seek medical attention and help. I was drinking more than I want to. This term, which was coined a long time ago by Jolene Park, I reference it in my TEDx talk, Sobriety Rocks, Who Knew? The term grey area drinkers, which sums it up very well. This isn't black or white. This isn't, either you are perfectly fine or you are at rock bottom. It's a spectrum of somewhere on that drinking booze elevator, if you like. And it was only when I realised, hold on, I can step off this booze elevator, and life is just so much better without alcohol. I can't stress that enough. So if you're someone who is drinking more than you want to, you'll know what I mean by that. If you're someone who doesn't have an off switch, every time you keep thinking, I'll just have one, and I'm going to stop drinking for a while, and you actually surprise yourself at how hard it feels, even though you're functioning fine, then the kind of stuff I do is for you. So you check out my other podcast as well, Alcohol Free Life, and check out the Sober Club that I run, which is a community of people who, some are just sober curious, they're thinking about it. Some have been sober for years, but we focus on the what's next, the living your best life free from the booze. That's the main focus. How can we focus on creating a life that we don't want to escape from? That's the absolute key. So anyways, having said all of that, of course, there are many people who take the traditional route and go to AA and work 12-step programs. And while that's absolutely not for me, of course, I totally respect the way that AA has, just been just incredible. Impact is incredible, and still is. If what you want is in-person meetings, then many people tell me that they're very hard to beat. So I absolutely buy into that. But one of the things that I come up against quite a lot is people will say to me, "I'm struggling with the concept of higher power that's discussed in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I find this really keeping me stuck. I'm an atheist, or I just don't really want to focus on a religious aspect, or whatever it might be. And it's a really interesting, it can be a very interesting kind of barrier. So when I came across the work of Dr. Peg O'Connor, I thought it was really fascinating. And what Peg does is she she digs deep into this idea that what might a higher power mean, and I'll let her describe it for herself, but it's quite a fascinating topic. So Peg O'Connor is a professor of philosophy in St. Peter, Minnesota, and specializes in moral philosophy, feminist philosophy, and addiction studies. She's author of Life on the Rocks, Finding Meaning in Addiction and Recovery. And she has been sober for goodness knows, I forget exactly how many years, an awful long time, and has a fascinating take on it all. So, just to preempt, as I said before, personally, my approach is I work with people who are not clinically dependent. And my approach is for those people who would class themselves as grey area drinkers, drinking more than they want to. But I think the concepts that she talks about, whichever way you decide to come to this, will be really beneficial for you to kind of have an understanding of. So I hope you enjoy the interview.
I'm so pleased that my guest is Dr. Peg O'Connor. Peg has been sober for 34 years. Amazing. And she's the author of the new book, Higher and Friendly Powers, Transforming Addiction and Suffering. I'm sure there's an awful lot more to say about you, Peg, but welcome to the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's certainly a wonderful podcast series you have, so I'm honored to be here.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Well, first of all, where are you? Whereabouts in the world are we chatting?
So I'm in the United States. I'm in the state of Minnesota, which is about smack dab in the middle. Cool. And they tend to be cold and snowy during the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're not doing so bad here ourselves. It's really freezing at the moment in the UK, but not too much snow. So let's just tell me a little bit about your background then. Before you started to write books and stuff, let's take you right back. I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone who's been sober for 34 years. That is so cool. So take us right back to the start of your journey.
Oh, the start of my journey. I was about 13 years old. I just posted a TikTok video about this too, your first drink, that those of us who struggle with alcoholism oftentimes remember our first drink and our last drink as if they happened yesterday. And that's what it's like for me. So I was about 13 years old. It was right after my grandmother's funeral, where we had the hospitality at my home, and I was helping my mom clean up, trying to be a good, responsible daughter. And there was this glass of an amber liquid. I didn't know what it was, but for some reason, I picked it up and I threw it back. And I simultaneously felt sick to my stomach and totally alive. And it turned out that lovely amber beverage was scotch. And I was off and running pretty quickly. I probably had a full-blown addiction to alcohol by the time I was 16. And I carried that with me through my college years, and I would stop and I would start, I'd stop and I'd start. I would never drink during my athletic seasons. I was a tennis and squash player, so I wouldn't drink then. And I'd tell myself, see, I can quit. I don't have a problem. Addicts can't quit. And it never counted as information that I'd always start right back up at the end of the season party. And I sobered up when I was very young. I wasn't quite 22. So that's how I've gotten to have all these years of sobriety. I started early and I quit early. Right. And I'm awfully grateful that I did.
Yeah. So, Peg, you're a professor of philosophy specializing in addiction. So, I mean, I'm guessing, you really do know this inside and out, all of this stuff. But I think it's really interesting that what you're addressing in this book is those people who struggle with the kind of Christian-centered God, at the heart of AA. Now, there'll be a lot of people listening to this podcast who have never encountered AA. So, a lot of people haven't used AA, but one of the reasons why they've been put off is the fact that they don't want to enter into that kind of religious bit. So what would you tell us then? What is it that you want to share about this term higher power that is often used? Well, it's the touchstone, really, isn't it, of AA?
It is a touchstone of AA, but the term higher power came from American philosopher and psychologist William James back in 1902. And then Bill Wilson adopted it and narrowed the meaning. So the original term, higher and friendly power, and it was plural oftentimes, had to do with anything larger that would take you beyond your own embattled little self. And so you could reach outward to something like ideals of truth or beauty. You could believe in the decency of humanity. You could think maybe I'm even possibly capable of being a self. Anything larger will do if it helps you to either reach outward to something more or to reach inward to something more. And it's important to know that there are as many higher powers as there are individuals in the world. And a higher power doesn't do anything to you, but having that sense of connection with something more, something different, something other than you, it could be with a group of friends, it could be with music, it could be with art, that having that connection enables you to do something for yourself. It can enable you to change in very significant kinds of ways so that you can become, the term reborn has become so freighted with meaning, but you can be regenerated, rejuvenated. You can become a new person, or you can return to a version of yourself that you loved and respected. So that's what a
Absolutely.
higher and friendly power is. That's very different from a providential God who's got a plan for you, and your job is to sit down, shut up, and get out of the way and let this God do everything for you, including taking away your desire to drink and removing your defects of character.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, you're absolutely right. That really is very off-putting, as is for many people the kind of concept that we are powerless and we need God to help us with this. How would you tackle that concept?
Oh, I think that's right. And we all struggle with that concept of powerlessness, except we accept that we're powerless over all different kinds of things. And we accept that in everyday life in so many ways. We're powerless over gravity. There is so much that is beyond our control, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it. So to be powerless over alcohol is just to say, here's one thing that I can't get a handle on, that I can't control. It doesn't mean that I'm powerless over everything in my life. It's just, here's this one thing that I'm having a hard time handling. And many people feel powerless over their weight. If they have issues with eating or issues with food, other people feel powerless about not understanding all of the ins and outs of a tax code, for example. So powerlessness is part of human life.
Yeah.
But the idea that being powerless over one thing extends to being powerless over everything, that's the step that many of us are unwilling to take. So when we can recognize what we have power over, what's in our control, and what we don't, we're going to be much happier people. And so if I can say, I could clearly say I didn't have power over alcohol. Once I started, I kept going until I was blackout, passed out, drunk. I couldn't control it. But what I could control was a decision to try to do something differently.
Yeah.
So admitting that there's something that you can't handle may be the very thing that empowers you to then take a different kind of relationship to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I know that in the book you talk about, of course, multiple paths out of addiction. There is no wrong or right, and that's something I talk about a lot. But what's your view on whether some people are more susceptible to addiction? What's your belief there?
Oh, I think some people are more susceptible to it. So on one accounting, addiction is an equal opportunity condition in a negative sense. None of us is immune from it. All of us have the potential to develop an addiction. But some of us are far more susceptible to beginning to engage in behaviors that at first may seem adaptive, but then become maladaptive. So there's a very strong correlation, for example, between those of us who develop addictions early and with childhood trauma or adverse experiences. There are correlations too between people being economically, socially, or politically marginalized and exploited. that many people turn to alcohol and other drugs as a kind of self-soothing behavior. And if you've got so many more stressors in your life, you've got so much more to self-soothe, it's more likely that you might develop an addiction.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
You know, I've often mentioned the adverse childhood experiences study that I'm sure you've come across, and it's a staggering percentage of people who score really just a fairly low score, but the link to them being more likely to have an addiction is quite incredible. What do you think about you know, why do some people have such an issue seeking treatment or seeking help? I mean, I know in my own case, I didn't consider I was never at rock bottom, but I was absolutely drinking too much. And there was a huge shame in admitting that, for starters. And then when I did eventually sort of reach out a little bit, just very tentatively, to general practitioners, you know, doctors in the UK, if I was doing something else, if I was going for something else, I was usually met with a very glib kind of, oh, well, you seem fine, just have an alcohol-free day. And that actually kept me stuck for years.
Oh, yes. I can easily imagine that. I was in college and I got terribly sick. I had mononucleosis and chickenpox at the same time. And I was at the school's infirmary, and the physician said, now, you can't drink during this because your spleen and pancreas are affected. So that's not going to be a problem, is it? Now, I'm going to sit there in my little paper gown and say, yeah, that's going to be a major problem. I don't think that I can. So I think physicians and healthcare providers have a special role to play. And some of them are getting much better at doing alcohol or drug screenings to try to get a sense that there are many of us in the world who are using and abusing alcohol and other drugs. And it's just become part of the daily fabric of my life. And you put your finger on it. I think a lot of it has to do with shame. And I think there are so many gendered dimensions of shame as well that we don't always pay enough attention to. So I think that the shame around women drinking, particularly when they're mothers, is quite high. And I think that there's shame around men drinking. Sometimes, well, these are guys who can't hold their liquor, they can't hold their alcohol, or that they're failing to meet those gendered roles about being a good father, being strong, being a good provider. And so, you know, shame, I think, is such a catalyst for addiction. It can cause it, and it's a consequence of it, and it becomes this just ungainly mess that nobody wants to try to get a handle on.
What is the state of play in the States? Because you know, in the UK, there's definitely been a bit of a tide turning, as it were. Younger people, for starters, are definitely not drinking the way we used to. Millennials are, you know, making some very good choices, and many not drinking at all. So it does feel as though the tide is turning a little bit. Having said that, of course, I had an interview with a doctor just recently, and the actual rate of alcohol-related deaths has gone up massively because of lockdowns and God knows what. So it's not all a lovely picture, but it does feel that the tide is slowly turning. What's it like where you are?
I'm going to say it's a yes and. So with the rise of Sober Curious and Dry January, I think it's a lot of, I'm going to say this, young women, so women in their 30s who are really thinking about how much they're drinking or using. And they're maybe taking a more proactive and intentional stance towards their own use. Where we are seeing a huge increase in alcohol-related deaths is in the demographic of women in their 50s and 60s. And that may seem surprising, except it's not, because that's also the demographic that is under enormous stress that's increased exponentially with the pandemic with respect to child rearing and child care, and then also caring for our own elderly parents. So you've got women in their 50s and 60s who might be taking care of 3 different generations.
Yeah.
And many women are presenting more with anxiety and depression. And with anxiety becomes the prescriptions for the benzos. And the rate of prescriptions for benzos in the US charts a remarkably steep parallel course as the uptick we had in prescription opioids.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about that for a minute. So,
well, it's just the same here. I mean, I can't tell you how many clients I have who will come to me because they want to talk about, their about alcohol, but it will it will turn out that basically they're on antidepressants and often HRT, but they've never been asked about their drinking. They're just given the antidepressants without being asked about the fact that they're downing a bottle of wine every night. Now, how can that possibly work?
Right. And that's why we're seeing so many accidental overdoses. I mean, most overdoses involve multiple substances, and some kind of work in an unholy way together and result in remarkably depressed respiration, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your, the some of the points that you raise in your book, particularly around how we can undertake, we'll use this phrase, spiritual recovery, without being religious, without, bringing in religion. Tell me what you mean by that.
So I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between spirituality and religion. So I'm just going to define religions as oftentimes involving social organizations that are unified around doctrine or dogma and different kinds of rituals and practices. So those are religions.
Yeah.
And I don't have all that much interest in religions. What I have an interest in is spirituality. And so the philosopher William James, who coined higher power, talked about the way that our spiritual impulses are part of our human nature as much as our biology or physiology, for example. It's just part of who we are. And what he means by that simply is a belief that there's more to the universe than just me as an individual, and that each of us can choose that to which he, she, or they will stand in solemn relationship. And what really matters is what springs from those spiritual impulses that enable a person to expand. So again, to either reach out to others or to reach inward. And I think that's really crucially important because more people are identifying as being spiritual but not being religious.
Yeah.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Yes.
And so to try to give people more examples to help them authorize to decide what is spiritual for them, or what does spirituality mean for each of them. And that to think about these questions is not to engage in a luxury or not to be kind of idle thoughts, but they're deeply connected to who we are and how we suit up and show up in the world. But we get so busy. I think all the busyness and all of our connection through social media and our cell phones and all of that, what that does is it suppresses that spirituality. It suppresses people's willingness to be able to sit quietly by themselves for a while and to think about those kinds of questions. We're too busy. And that busyness is harming us in a very fundamental kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, actually, drinking alcohol does that as well. Stops us from being able to sit and be quiet. I know. I used to interview. I was a presenter on Hay House Radio for many years, so I used to interview all kinds of leading meditation gurus. But of course, back then when I was drinking, if I ever tried to sit in meditation, well, it was laughable. Because of course, a little voice somewhere deep down would be saying, what the hell do you think you're doing? You're not even authentic with who you're meant to be, let alone, So yeah.
I totally hear you. I try to meditate, and I feel like I've got fraud alert in aisle 11, fraud alert in aisle 11.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
I think we are so scared to sit silently with ourselves. I think we're afraid of discovering things about ourselves, or we think that we're being self-indulgent. And I think that's one of the great gifts of recovery, is that ability to just sit still.
Yeah.
And not feel like I have to do everything right now, or to be able to slow down the mind just for a little bit to say, and this is right where I am right now. And I want to dwell in gratitude rather than busyness or grievance.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually can, begin to like ourselves a little bit more once we stop drinking. There's no doubt about it.
And isn't that surprising that he was like, wait a minute, there are things totally about myself that are likable? What?
I mean,
am I lying to myself?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting as well that, I think sometimes people have been put off religion, they've been put off spirituality because of religion, not just connected to drinking, but with anything, actually. They've kind of had that. Maybe it's been drummed into them at school from a very young age that you must be a certain way, you must pray a certain way, that you're going to be punished if this happens and punished if that happens. That, there's an awful lot of aspects of religion that really don't involve very much love or compassion in the way it's played out, right?
I think that's absolutely true. And what happens is that one person's spiritual experience can function as a foundation for a religion. And so a religion can grow up around certain individuals' spiritual experiences. One might argue that's exactly where Catholicism came from, for example. Yeah. But spiritual impulses should really burn brightly at our center. There's this wonderful expression from William James, the personal center of habitual energy. This is 1902, so it sounds, new wave. What kind of fluff is that? But do spiritual impulses, do they burn as an acute fever? And so not the dull kind of secondhand religions that, oh yeah, I'm a Catholic, so I got to go to confession before I get the Eucharist, blah, 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 where you can't actually justify what you're doing other than saying, well, it's because of what I've always done, versus something that burns at my center, that is the hot spot of my consciousness, that I can't ignore that. And I don't want to ignore that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you like people to get from this book, Peg? What were you really hoping when you wrote this?
So I wrote this book for me, like most things I write. So I tried an AA meeting when I was, 18 or 19. And I remember and I was raised Catholic. And I walked in there and I heard the God language, and I heard the steps being read, and I heard how it works being read about, okay, if I fail, it's because I'm constitutionally incapable and fundamentally dishonest. And I ran out of there so quickly that I never went to an AA meeting again for another 20 years. I've been 20 years sober, actually. And so my hope for this book, I'm trying to hit, maybe if I were to draw a Venn diagram, there wouldn't be much overlap here. People who absolutely love AA and it's worked for them, because programs can work for people. And Bill Wilson, who founded AA, regarded William James as a co-founder, even though William James had been dead for 25 years before Bill Wilson had his big aha moment and finally sobered up. So people who love the history of AA to say, well, here's this person who was writing in such ways that Bill Wilson was bowled over by it. So people who love AA. But more importantly are the people who have struggled with AA because of that Christian-centric notion of God, to say, you know what, let's take this concept and return it to its more inclusive and expansive sense. And each person can come to see that they can author their own conversion. They can author their own fundamental changes in their lives so that they can change, so that they can maybe move into a life of recovery or sobriety, or so fundamentally reduce their harmful use that they feel like they become a different person, and that they're able to kind of reap the benefits of no longer having alcohol or drugs or other addictive behaviors right at their center, right as their habitual center of personal energy. So it's really meant to be an invitation to people to explore their spiritual side and to figure out what might function as a higher power for them.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much, Peg. I really appreciate your time. The book is Higher and Friendly Powers, Transforming Addiction and Suffering. Where can we find out more about your work?
We can find out more about my work at pegoconnorauthor.com. And Higher and Friendly Powers is available on Amazon. And you can probably order a copy through your local independent bookstore if you still have one of those.
Yeah,
and
just about.
Just about, right? Yeah.
Cool.
And I also write a blog for Psychology Today called Philosophy Stirred, Not Shaken. And a lot of it is on philosophy and addiction, but a lot of it too is about it's kind of philosophical questions about meaning of life.
Fantastic. Peg, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Peg. So we'll make sure that there's some stuff around the book. We'll put some notes for that. And as before, if you are someone who thinks maybe it's time to ditch the booze, or perhaps you've been sober for a while, but you want to focus now on creating that life you don't have to escape from, then come and check out the work that we do in the Sober Club. It's thesoberclub.com. And you can join us. Just join us for a month if you like. There's so much content. There's a whole library of content in there. There's a private community. We have regular Zoom meetings, and there's just an awful lot of support, plus an online course which is called Get the Buzz Without the Booze, which sums up quite nicely the work that we do. So you'd be very welcome to pop along there. Thank you so much for listening to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show on UK Health Radio, and I'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show on UK Health Radio.